So, a summer of riots, Fergus.
Absolutely.
In England and some other parts of the United Kingdom as well. But were they really riots? It seems to me that the terminology that we use to describe these civil disturbances, they shift, especially if we look at this in an historical context. I mean, when is a riot not a riot? When is it just a legitimate protest? I'm reminded of a famous remark by a late Elizabethan Jacobean courtier called Harrington, who said in one of his collection of quips, said, treason doth never prosper. Why say so? Because treason, if it prospers, none dare call it treason. Success matters quite a lot, doesn't it? Retrospectively, when judging these things.
Absolutely. There's sort of the terminology which we use around civil discord, as the prayer book would have it, is sort of implicit with moral judgment. It's sort of pregnant with moral judgment. You know, a legitimate protest and a riot. Now, both might involve breaking windows. Both will involve the need for the state to regulate by using its powers against assembly, against violence, etc., etc. But the actual endpoint, and that's of relevance now because, of course, we are seeing prosecutions for under various bits of legislation of civil disturbance for some protests and not for others. And yes, when is a riot not a riot? Well, when the judge decides.
And when it's successful, when the cause has been sanctified by, as it were, the march of history. I can't remember who it was. I think it's the late Tony Benn who said about the protests in India against colonial rule there. He said it's a funny thing, these protests and these riots, they're much castigated at the time, but then if they're successful and they are endorsed in the legislative process and the alleged grievances are redressed, then they invite you around to tea in Buckingham Palace.
Yes. And it goes back a very long way. You know, this isn't a modern thing. We might be thinking about some of the 20th and 21st and indeed very contemporary examples, but this goes back really quite a long way into the state's relationship with organised protest.
Well, let's start perhaps with the Sacheverell riots. Very, very big protests. Tens of thousands of people in the streets and protesting in favour of the High Church clergyman Dr. Sacheverell, whose protests and his sermons were incendiary and led to the passage of the legislation of the Riot Act.
Indeed. So the reading of the Riot Act, dates from that period. From this, you get these waves of popular Anglican Tory unrest, and again, it's important that we get into the mindset of this. That actually, and I think Michael Foote writes about this in his introduction to Gulliver's Travels, where he says, "Yes, I have to admit, Swift was a Tory, but let us not forget the Tories were the party of the people." And that is essentially the case. That Sacheverell taps in his sermon into a genuine kind of disgust at the Whig governing class.
It's a necessary corrective to the idea that the Glorious Revolution, once it had happened, solved all constitutional problems in England.
Absolutely, and indeed, there's what the Sacheverell riots do. So Sacheverell preaches this sermon on the 5th of November as part of the gunpowder plot service in London, which has just elected. The Freemen of the City of London have elected a Tory Lord Mayor. So again, counterbalance the narrative that it's the interests of commerce arrayed against the squirearchy and the church. There are plenty of Tory business owners. I think of Ned Ward, the great Tory publican in London, who is arrested numerous times for seditious libel. Sacheverell preaches a sermon on the 5th of November, and the understanding of the Whig establishment is this is one of the great days in the calendar for restating the principles of the Glorious Revolution, because it is about the inherent threat that the Roman Catholic Church poses to the British constitutional settlement. And Sacheverell would have been expected to preach at length on the evils of popery. He spends about a minute on popery, and he then levels a blistering attack on what he sees as the fifth columnists within the church. These Whigs, those who advocate for toleration, backdoor Presbyterians.
It's a big attack on fat cats.
It is.
It?
It is.
Fat cat Whigs in the City of London.
Absolutely.
And it reflects this kind of old idea of there being somehow a natural alliance between the forces of monarchy and ordinary people, the pretty purpose.
And that there is this cast of sort of both who are both sort of capitalistic and they are progressive in the sense that their views are out of step with the views of the people. They are advanced in their views, whereas the people are remaining, clinging on to the ancient ways. And there is this cast of people who will go out of their way to make the lives of the ordinary people a misery. That is essentially what Sacheverell is saying. And he said the church is the canary in the coal mine here.
It's very important to remember the role not just of apologetics and public rhetoric, I think, but the role of fear-mongering, rumour, gossip, spreading, especially perhaps in rural areas, but also in the inner cities, as we call them now. And we saw this happening this summer, didn't we?
Absolutely.
Lots of those people who went out to riot thought that they were marching against a noxious version of Islam.
Yes, absolutely. And this is what happened. So the Whigs sort of proved Sacheverell right by putting him on trial, by saying, actually, we have enough political power, enough financial power, and enough general sort of oomph that we can crush you. And by putting Sacheverell on trial, they are essentially putting Toryism on trial.
Yes.
And this gets out in the country, and you're right, exactly, a mirror image of what we saw happen this summer in the United Kingdom happens, where people are whipped up into these rages, essentially, about what the government is doing, and about this concept, again, and it's so fascinating to see the repeated tropes, that there is this two-tier system, that they're not fair.
Yeah. It's the just against the unjust, forces of self-proclaimed righteousness, progressive values and all of that, against the uninstructed wisdom of the people who don't want to have their lives messed around.
Absolutely.
Now, there are echoes of that and what happened in the United Kingdom this summer. But the echoes are, they're very, well, as you're saying, they are very, very ancient.
They are.
I mean, consider the French Revolution, the revolutionary events in Paris. They really reflected a massive network of fear and protest called the Great Fear, of the Grand Peur, that had been going on for months before the events of 14th of July started to unfold. Fear of foreigners was a very big thing among the French, specifically fears of about Austria, and Austria's designs on French land and French territory. And then there's this whole fascinating thing of the just price, isn't there? And now the just price, as described by Aquinas, among other medieval theologians, described the natural order of things, how things should be, so that people were not profiteering unfairly. We may be going back to another example of that later on this summer with legislations perhaps even for price controls. We may yet have price controls again in the future.
Absolutely, and there is a real pattern, particularly in Western Europe, of all the way into the 20th century even, of agricultural and then wider economic depression being an obvious stimulant for unrest. And that's one doesn't have to be a sort of Marxist historian to believe to view the obvious link between the two, but it goes back to more than simply just dearth and a lack of resources to go round. You're right. There is a sense that this violence breaks out when an unwritten rule of fairness has been broken, and I think
frequently there are protests against monopolists.
Absolutely.
And against what is seen as the modern age in arms.
Absolutely.
As we saw in the Rebecca rioters in my part of Wales, in West Wales, in the late 1830s and 40s, when local farmers were dressed up as women, Rebecca, they claim to be in the Bible, or imitation of Rebecca anyway, and protesting against the very high rates of tolls introduced on movements of agricultural land, agricultural goods from the farm to other parts of the land. But what's very striking, throughout so many of these protests, these are conservative-minded people, aren't they? I mean, they think the natural order has been is threatened and needs to be protected.
Riots are almost always, I would suggest, certainly in their original form, reactionary.
Yes.
They are almost always a reaction against a change in circumstances, generally imposed from above, that have affected the lives of the ordinary people. The Rebecca riots, I think of the Captain Swing riots, and of course the Luddites, Ned Ludd. These are explicitly anti-technological riots. The idea. So rioting is it's almost a primal howl against the march of progress, and that's why, again, elites are often in favour of progress because it is being shaped by them. It financially benefits them.
Chartism in this country is very interesting from that point of view. From its origins in the 1830s, the emergence of the Great Charter, up to its real high point, I think, in 1848,
Yes.
when they gather on what was Kennington Common, now Kennington Park. Tens of thousands of people there, captured in one of the earliest recorded examples of pictorial photography. Now, they were advancing the cause, which would be regarded as radical, progressive by many, of universal male suffrage. So that was the straightforwardly political dimension. But they were also protesting about the economics of their age, weren't they?
They were.
They thought that, again, natural order is being disrupted, people were profiteering, they wanted economic stability.
And there's a sense here where almost the medium is the message. How they go about it is absolutely fascinating. A charter is made to the monarch, addressed to the monarch.
Yes.
They gather in a large public common space just outside of London, and there they wait for their demands to be addressed. Now, that is a carbon copy of the tactics of the Peasants' Revolt, of Cade's Rebellion, of the Prayer Book Rebellion.
Of the protest in Tsarist Russia.
Absolutely.
When the peasantry would say, nothing wrong with the Tsar is the holy father of the people, but he's surrounded by wicked people who are giving him bad advice.
The king's bad counsellors. And it's interesting that the closest of these that comes to any sort of success in this country is of course the Peasants' Revolt, where, again, to go back to that sense of economic thing, who do they target when they get into London? The Lombards, who are considered to be, holding this economic stability.
And suspiciously foreign.
Suspiciously foreign, absolutely, completely right. Now, the Jews have been expelled by this point, but of course, realistically, they would have been a ditto a target at the same time. People who are different, people who occupy a particular economic purpose. And then they go after the king's counsellors. They go after, the Chancellor, Simon of Sudbury. They drag him out, behead him very, very brutally. It is about, this is the king is being badly advised, and we need to do something about it. And so there's this...
There's the restoration of the old order, the traditional order, when there were good councillors in place, and the king would follow their demands, and there'd be somehow a kind of consensual thing.
Restoration of our ancient rights.
Unity of the ancient rights.
It strikes me, is it not fascinating, that an awful lot of, I don't know if you've been following some of the prosecutions in magistrates' courts of people involved in writing, Magna Carta comes up an awful lot.
It does.
People are invoking it, almost always incorrectly, but there's still something in the sort of folk memory of England about this idea of our ancient rights.
Anglo-Saxon liberty.
Absolutely.
Anglo-Saxon freedom.
Absolutely.
Usurped by, again, a very wicked group of foreigners. Normans coming in.
Wicked Normans coming in.
The imposition of what in the 17th century became known as the Norman yoke.
Yes.
And this was very subversive of the rights of the free-born Englishman. Now, isn't it interesting on another tack that justifying protest by an appeal to the social context is quite often a tool of the classical left. These people are harried, they're very poor, they need to do something to respond, and their violence, although regrettable, is surely understandable in the social context. But now, an awful lot of conservative commentators have been using exactly that kind of line of argument not to justify and say, it's terrible what some of them did. Nonetheless, you've got to understand this in the context of society as it has become in some arguably very deprived parts of the United Kingdom. So this is a strange.
It's interesting, which leads us to our original question. When is a riot not a riot? Well, when I agree with the person who's doing the rioting, and this is the thing that both the left and the right are perfectly capable of making apology for things. It's absolutely fascinating. It's a fascinating recent case of this in the United States of America, where one can argue that sort of elaborate fiction of freeborn Anglo-Saxons is much more established and much more dangerous, arguably, I'd say, in the United States. And certainly people like Burke are writing about it and saying, well, actually, there is a difference between what they're doing over there. But, there was, in the late Obama presidency, there was a very popular musical in New York about Alexander Hamilton. Yes. And essentially making the argument for Hamilton's
absolutely dreadful, ahistorical
bit
of nonsense.
And what is fascinating in it is, I couldn't agree more, one of the villains in that is Bishop Samuel Seabury.
Yes.
And Bishop Samuel Seabury comes along and writes, because there was the Farmer Papers that him and Hamilton had this argument about, via pamphlet in the lead up to the American Rebellion. And Seabury says, you must not heed the rebels who scream revolution. They don't have your interests at their heart, basically. That is Seabury's argument. And in this musical, essentially, you can't have this chaos, you can't have this bloodshed, etc. Seabury is portrayed as a kind of hand-wringing moderate who is wicked and evil. Fast forward 7 years, fast forward 10 years, 14 years or whatever, to when President Donald J. Trump is essentially inciting violence at the US Capitol. What are the Obamas they take to the stage and say, given that the Hamilton is sort of court entertainment for the Obama court, and they say, heed not these rebels who scream revolution because they don't have your interests at heart. So it's absolutely fascinating that you can have this sort of, even if the foundation myth of your country is based on the idea that you strike out and you do the right thing, there are still going to be times when you are on Samuel Seabury's side.
Another term that crops up regularly in these sort of discussions about just price, right price, rebellion, is the whole idea of justified resistance and populism.
Yes.
And you can't move for people in this country nowadays who are using the word populist as if it's somehow a good thing.
Yes, yes.
Whereas in its original sense, it's actually taking a very complex situation, reducing it to its so-called populist fundamental elements, but then using it to whip up discord.
What it really is, I would suggest, is that actually, when people sort of try and use the word populist, what they really are talking about is the fact that, democracy isn't a uniformly good system. Democracy isn't always sensible, and actually asking the general public their opinions on things is often complicated. Yeah. But we have this...
As we've seen in the Brexit referendum.
As we've seen in the Brexit referendum.
The example of the triumph of a kind of populist argument.
And you have this sense that we can't, because we've made this agreement in the West, particularly after the Second World War, that democracy is sacrosanct, it cannot be touched.
Yes.
We can't
and that it's somehow inviolable as
yes,
well.
it is.
That it has somehow a prehensile ability to protect itself.
Absolutely, and it must be, the more freer the people, the freer the country, the freer, the more people have a say, the more there will be. It's the idea behind these deranged citizens' assemblies. If only we could get people more involved in democracy, they'll make the right decision because they'll become and think like me, a member of the elite. Yeah. That doesn't happen, and it's deranged to think that it happens, but we continue to think it. But because we can't actually have a mature conversation, I would suggest, about the idea that, in fact, democracy needs to be checked, and indeed Britain always had checks on the rule of the mob.
Well, it's also had a populace that is terribly law-abiding.
Yes, really. and generally disinterested in a lot of this stuff, has no real desire. Yeah. And that, again...
the Hyde Park riots, 1866, yes. The government's proposals for an increased element of the franchise proved unacceptable to a very large part of the population, including many middle-class radicals, but a lot of popular reaction and agitation against it as well. Some 200,000 people, I think, gathered in Hyde Park. One policeman only killed. Bad for the policeman, bad for his family. But these were very, very law-abiding protests. Yes. And what happened then? Onward march of democracy.
Yep.
had the 1867 Reform Act, which met most of the demands of those who wanted a more comprehensive male franchise.
Yes.
So and if you look at those people going back to the photograph of the Chartists, there are an awful lot of people sitting there and standing there wearing top hats.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very kind of there are very middle class elements, and then there are more working class elements.
Absolutely.
And this is what makes these campaigns, when they're political, when they're politicized, they are different from just random acts of violence.
Yes, they are. And if there is an explicit political motivation. Now, I would suggest there's an element where the middle class is privileged there because it can often express it in the terms that are acceptable to the elite. So if we take the counter-protest, or we take, for example, the protests that we've seen regularly in London around the situation in Palestine, there are some quite eloquent middle-class liberals who can articulate why that falls within the rights of protest, etc., etc. Realistically, there are people who are on a council estate in Sunderland who might also feel very unrepresented by the system, who feel angry at things going on that they don't have control over.
And suddenly they're overtaken by events.
Precisely.
There's lots of these people who were caught up in the protests, weren't they? And they weren't told about them particularly beforehand. They were started as bystanders,
Absolutely.
and then a rage somehow overwhelms them, and they pick up a brick.
And people go and have a look. You go back to the Sacheverell riots. The numbers that we are talking about in those are huge. For Georgian England, 10,000 people, etc.
Yes.
That is a sizable crowd.
Yes.
The idea that each and every one of them could articulate a complicated high Tory view of the Constitution
had a propagandistic kind of pamphlet in their pockets to which they could refer, as it were.
Is nonsense. And of course it's nonsense. And it goes back to the kind of, what we talk about the kind of element of disinterest. There is a point where that sort of snaps over into action.
And then you do have, I think, a proper riot on your hands.
And that's when you...
Because riots are mass emotion.
Yes.
And a mass emotion, whether in politics or religion, can be very, very exciting.
Yes.
It's more exciting than your day-to-day existence, certainly.
Absolutely. And there's also a sense on the ground that, well, this time we can do it. We can succeed in whatever it is, even if you cannot totally articulate what it is you're there to do. There is a sense now, of course, an unimpassioned, cold-hearted, distant view of the historian says, well, actually, generally riots don't work. They're quite a bad way of achieving your policy aims. And quite a good way
in that they provoke a counter-reaction.
Correct. And historically, if you want to get something done, that's probably not the way to do it. But that's not how the man on the ground who's picked up the brick feels. And there's also a sense of, wanting to... Again, you see, I think we see this in France in the 1780s, I think arguably we've seen it this summer. There is, I think, a sense where people it is a last resort. There is no, I am a powerless person with nothing to lose. Why shouldn't I throw that brick? Now, obviously there are bad faith actors within that who take advantage of those people. That's not to deny that. But I do think there is, people don't riot when things are just ticking along.
But it's also remarkable how very peaceful industrial relations have been in this country ever since the first example of widespread strikes in the 1890s in Goldfield and in the docks, big dock strike in London in the late 1890s, and then even in the case of the general strike, which is marked by a high degree of social and interclass solidarity as well.
Absolutely. And now almost forgotten.
Yes.
People don't, I think, remember the certain sort of fringe leftist groups perhaps might seek to memorialise it and make it a big deal. But it's a fascinating, given what a big deal it was at the time, how it's sort of slightly fallen into, people know about the Jarrow Marches, I suppose, but there's sort of this... But you're right, there's this regular...
And of course you had to have a trades union congress in order for there to be a general strike.
Exactly.
And getting a TUC established in the first place took years and years and years.
Absolutely.
Because all of these little unions and middle-sized unions they liked running their own show.
Absolutely.
You know, why should the cordwainers unite with the ironworkers?
Which again, one can draw direct parallels with guild movements, etc. In the medieval period. You know, there is nothing new under the sun. But it is interesting that with a couple of exceptions, the history of labour, relations between organised labour and the state are pretty placid, really, in this country.
Up until, I would argue, the 1970s and early 80s and the miners' strikes.
Which comes now...
Which has produced all sorts of conspiracy theories.
Yes, and I think what's interesting is I think there is a mythology of labour in this country.
Yes.
You know, let's forget. You know, it's actually, what is it? It's less than 20 years between, you know, the election of 1906, when the first sort of actual inroads are made for the Labour Party, and then forming a government, kissing hands with George V. You know, and actually Ramsay MacDonald being probably his favourite prime minister as things went.
His very favourite cabinet minister was a chap called Jimmy Thomas.
Oh yes,
who became was a prominent member of the railway workers union, I think. He was also rather corrupt, but he had a very good line in Dirty Jokes,
and
being quite salty, and he used to keep George V endlessly amused with his great big line in Dirty Jokes. So much so that the king was laughing so hard at one of his jokes that he did himself an injury internally. He'd just been operated on, I think, for a duodenal ulcer, and the whole bloody thing indoors started to explode. And as a result of which, the opening of Parliament in, I think it's been 1931,
was delayed because his sides quite literally split.
split.
But it's fascinating, isn't it, that actually we talk about the moments of unrest, and we will discuss the miners' strike in a moment, but George VI's favourite premier by a country mile was Attlee. The late Queen's was Harold Wilson. I suspect that His Majesty probably gets on better with Sir Keir Starmer than he did with Rishi Sunak. I would imagine. There's every sign of that. So Labour, the organised forces of Labour in this country, actually got pretty close into the heart of the establishment pretty quickly, and found they rather liked it there.
Yes. And respectable Labour, always very, very keen on strong defence.
Absolutely.
And strong policing.
Absolutely.
And what working class communities really need, according to traditional Labour anyway, is good, strong law and order policies and a good, strong army and navy.
Bessie Braddock, the great, Liverpool MP, who went from being on the extremely, almost expelled for being a communist before the war, to being the most rigorous enthusiast for nuclear weaponry in the 1950s, to the extent where she almost Gateskill says she's too right-wing for the party. So there is of course, that tradition of the old right in Labour, who make the Tories look like pussycats on law and order, really.
Well, Ernest Bevin,
yes,
famous Foreign Secretary, loved the bomb.
Yeah.
Wanted Britain to have as many atomic bombs as possible, if you please, and by tomorrow morning.
Yes.
One of the founding fathers of NATO was relentlessly told by the Labour Party. So here again, there's a kind of alliance, isn't there, between the traditional forces of small C conservatism, army, navy, the monarchy, and the people.
The people, yeah. Absolutely.
And emerged in lots of propaganda about the East End during the Second World War. And that brilliant propagandist, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, a title that she loved, I think, because she got to be referred to as a queen twice over in one title, going into the East End and saying, oh, now I can look these guys in the face. And all these remarkable photos in Picture Post and elsewhere of the old traditional working class of the East End. The East Enders.
Yes.
That very culturally conservative programme. Looking at the monarchy in the eye as well.
Absolutely, and the idea that she sort of won the war, this woman had this aura. And that continued.
While eating a lot of grouse at Windsor Castle.
Yes, exactly, yes. But there is that sort of mystique, and it's something that sort of continues through. Now, there are those moments that perhaps threaten to disrupt it, but I can think of moments where there are some unrest among working class communities, and we think about the miners' strike. But yes, again, it's interesting. That is framed as who is one of the most extreme advocates for the miners in the House of Lords is the recently enabled Earl of Stockton, who spends his life making life and misery for Mrs. Thatcher, saying, these were the bravest of men. I led them on the Western Front.
These are the men who defeated the Kaiser.
Absolutely,
and Hitler.
So there's this implicit sense
it is terrible what is happening to them.
Again, also the man who said the problem with Mrs. Thatcher's cabinet is it has more Estonians than Etonians. Yes. So Macmillan was playing
rather
into
delicately anti-Semitic remark.
Yes, it was. Yes, exactly. His sort of Macmillan. Yes, his the fact that I think one of the least appealing things about him is the fact he does remain pretty privately anti-Semitic, even after liberating concentration camps during the Second War. But Macmillan is deliberately playing into a sentiment that the leaders of the peasants' revolt would have understood.
It's a folk memory of the unity of the people
with their leaders, and here are these nasty, grubby, money-grubbing people who are getting in between.
And I think this is why we are still so fascinated by the miners' strike.
Yes,
especially the one of 1983-84.
Yes.
And conspiracy theories and how the government had been stockpiling coal because it wanted to have a conflict. Well, it's fair enough for the government of the day, if it wanted to preserve civil order, to have large stockpiles of coal ready in the event of the miners' strike coming back again.
And of course, they have been caught without it in the 1970s. And there's also the fact that it's not unlike the Reformation. This was, Cardinal Wolsey closed at least as many monasteries as Cromwell did. Harold Wilson closed more mines than Margaret Thatcher did, and so there is again this myth that there was this moment of the crystallisation of this great struggle. In fact, this is a process we've been talking about for that's been happening more or less since the end of the Second World War.
And that's why that Thatcher phrase, "the enemy within," was so potent, wasn't it?
Inflammatory,
designed to be inflammatory,
absolutely,
and representing as law and order something that was very disruptive of traditional communities.
And that leads us on to another, fallout and unintended consequences of riots, particularly within British political history.
Yes.
That, what are they then used to do? What are they then used to justify? And essentially, Thatcher uses it not only to take on the Unions, but to reshape her own party as well. The Macmillanite strain is crushed essentially in that era. If we look at what I suspect will come through on the back of this round of rioting, will be more legislation around social media and speech.
It's the arrival of real class-based politics. I
think.
Yes. The other terrible phrase, as I think of it in that period, one of us. Of course, one of us means people who think like us, who have the same kind of relationship to property and to money, as opposed to those who have markedly less of either of those commodities. So one of us, many of us, the community and the traditions, an awful lot of historical analogies to be drawn here.
Absolutely.
And we'll think now about what we might do in terms of our next podcast, I guess.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening. Do join us for the next of this series of podcasts. For more information about EF's research and publication programme, go to www.erasmusforum.co.uk.